Homeless little girl asks Morgan Freeman for $20 and he refuses. What he does next will leave you speechless. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The biting cold of New York's winter wrapped itself around the city like a cruel embrace. The streets shimmered under the dim glow of streetlights, their orange hue flickering over patches of ice and puddles of slush. Pedestrians hurried past, wrapped in thick coats, their faces buried in scarves, oblivious to the silent figures huddled in alleyways and beneath cardboard shelters. Among them was Lena, a little girl no older than 10, her tangled hair barely visible beneath the oversized beanie she had found in a dumpster weeks ago. Her fingers, red from the cold, clutched an old paper cup, her tool for survival. Lena wasn't new to these streets. For as long as she could remember, the city had been her home, its gutters and back alleys serving as her playground, its occasional kindnesses the only warmth she knew. She had learned to navigate the hunger, the endless search for a safe place to sleep, and the way people averted their eyes as if ignoring her existence would erase her from their world. But tonight, hunger gnawed at her more than usual. She had eaten nothing since morning, and her tiny frame felt weaker with every step. She had hoped to find a few leftover fries in a trash can behind a fast food restaurant, but it had been emptied before she got there. Shuffling through the crowded sidewalks, Lena's eyes scanned the faces around her. Rich men in tailored suits, women in fur coats carrying designer bags, teenagers laughing as they sipped hot chocolate from paper cups. They all had $20 to spare, she was sure of it. Just one bill, and she could get a warm meal, maybe even a cheap motel room for the night. As she passed a brightly lit cafe, her gaze fell upon an elderly man sitting alone by the window, sipping from a steaming mug. He had deep brown skin, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and kind eyes that seemed to hold stories of a lifetime. Something about him made Lena pause. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for rejection, and stepped forward. "Sir, could you spare $20? Her voice was soft, polite, but edged with the quiet desperation of someone used to being ignored. The man, Morgan Freeman, lowered his cup and looked at her, truly looked at her. His deep voice, rich and warm like aged whiskey, carried an unexpected weight. "And what would you do with $20? He asked, his eyes studying her. Lena hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. She had been through this before. Some people wanted a sob story, some wanted an explanation, others just walked away. "I get something to eat," she replied simply. Morgan sighed, setting his cup down. $20, huh? His voice was thoughtful. "I could give you that, but would it really change anything?" Lena's heart sank. Another lecture, another rejection. She had heard it all before. People telling her they couldn't help, that she should go to a shelter, that she needed to earn kindness. She turned to leave, her hope shrinking like the last ember of a dying fire. But before she could take another step, Morgan spoke again. "What if I gave you enough to change your life?" Lena froze. She turned back slowly, her wide eyes filled with disbelief. "What do you mean?" Morgan Freeman smiled, a slow, knowing smile that carried the weight of something far bigger than $20. And with that, Lena's world was about to change forever. Lena's breath misted in the cold air as she stared at Morgan Freeman, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Enough to change her life? No one had ever said that to her before. People either handed her a few crumpled bills out of pity or turned away as if she didn't exist. But this man was looking at her like she mattered. She swallowed hard, her stomach twisting, not just from hunger, but from something unfamiliar. "Hope." Morgan gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit." His voice was calm, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Lena hesitated. She had learned the hard way that nothing in life came for free. People always wanted something in return, and she had no more to give than the clothes on her back and the stories trapped inside her. But something about him, his steady gaze, the warmth in his tone, made her feet move before she could think twice. She climbed onto the chair, her small body nearly disappearing inside the oversized hoodie she wore. Her fingers ached as they gripped the table's edge. Inside the cafe, The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls. The warmth seeped into her frozen bones, making her shiver. Morgan studied her for a moment before waving over a waiter. "Bring her something hot, and make sure it's big." His voice carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. Lena flinched at the gesture. "I don't need." Morgan lifted a hand. "I know you don't, but you deserve it." Silence stretched between them. Lena wasn't sure how to respond to kindness without strings attached. Instead, she watched as a steaming bowl of soup was placed in front of her, along with a plate stacked high with warm bread. The sight of real food, untouched, made her throat tighten. She hesitated, unsure if she should wait, but Morgan simply nodded. "Go on." The first spoonful burned her tongue, but she didn't care. She ate fast, her hunger overriding everything else. The bread was soft, the butter melting in the heat of her hands. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt a tear slip down her cheek. Morgan waited until her pace slowed before he spoke again. "Tell me something, Lena. What do you want?" Lena stopped mid-bite, blinking at him. It was such a simple question, but it felt heavier than anything she had ever been asked. She wanted to say money, because that was always the right answer. Money meant food, warmth, safety. But deep down, that wasn't all. She wanted to stop running. She wanted a bed that didn't belong to a shelter filled with screaming strangers. She wanted someone to remember her name in the morning. She wanted to wake up and know she wasn't alone. Her voice was small when she finally answered. "I just want a chance." Morgan leaned back, his fingers tapping the side of his cup. His eyes softened, filled with something Lena couldn't quite name. "Then let's make that happen." Lena frowned, uncertain. "You don't even know me?" Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't have to. I know that no child should have to fight this hard just to survive." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. He placed it gently on the table in front of her. "This isn't $20, Lena. It's a fresh start, but only if you're ready to take it." Lena stared at the envelope as if it might disappear. A fresh start? The idea was so big, so impossible, that it terrified her. Could she really believe in something like that? Outside, the city roared on, cold and indifferent. But inside this cafe, for the first time in her life, Lena had a choice. And she wasn't sure if she was brave enough to take it. Lena's fingers hovered over the envelope, hesitant to touch it. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words still hung in the air. A fresh start. It sounded like something out of a dream, something meant for kids in warm homes with loving parents, not for a girl who had spent most of her life dodging danger and digging through trash for her next meal. She swallowed hard. "What's inside?" Morgan took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "Enough to get you off the streets. A safe place to sleep. Food. A real chance." Lena's heart pounded. She had heard promises before, people claiming they wanted to help, only to disappear when things got complicated. No one ever gave something for nothing. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Morgan leaned forward, folding his hands together. "Because I know what it's like to start with nothing." His voice was steady, but there was a depth to it. Something old, something real. "And I know that the only difference between staying lost and finding your way is whether someone believes in you." Lena's throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever made her feel like she was worth more than the space she took up on the sidewalk. She stared at the envelope again, her mind racing. If she took it, everything would change. But what if it wasn't real? What if she got her hopes up only to have them shattered? She thought about the shelters. Overcrowded, dangerous. She thought about the winter nights, her body curled up in a doorway, shivering so hard she could barely breathe. She thought about hunger, the kind that clawed at her stomach until it felt like she was being eaten from the inside out. Then she thought about what it would feel like to be full, to be warm, to wake up in a bed that belonged to her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. Slowly, carefully, she lifted it and felt the thickness inside. Cash, paperwork, something more than just a handout. A second chance. She looked up at Morgan, fear and hope battling inside her chest. "What if I mess this up?" Morgan smiled, gentle, reassuring. "Then we try again?" Lena inhaled sharply. No one had ever given her that kind of answer before. She tightened her grip on the envelope. The fear was still there, but for the first time, so was the belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to be lost forever. Outside, the cold wind howled against the cafe window, but inside, something inside Lena had started to thaw. She didn't know where this road would take her, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. Lena clutched the envelope tightly, as if it might vanish if she let go. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her decision settling over her like a thick blanket. The idea of leaving the streets behind felt unreal, like something that only happened to other people. People with luck, with families, with second chances. Morgan watched her with quiet patience, his eyes filled with something she wasn't used to seeing: belief. Not pity, not judgment, just belief. It unnerved her. What if he was wrong about her? What if she wasn't worth saving? She forced herself to look away, her gaze landing on the reflection in the cafe's window. The girl staring back at her looked like a ghost, skin too pale from cold, lips chapped, hair tangled beyond repair. She barely recognized herself. Morgan's voice was steady, grounding. You don't have to decide everything today, Lena. One step at a time, one step. That was something she could understand. She exhaled shakily and looked at him. Where do I even start? Morgan smiled. By trusting that you're not alone anymore. He stood, pulling a neatly folded coat from the chair beside him. Come on, let's get you somewhere warm. Lena hesitated. Instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear before this could all turn out to be a cruel joke. But her hunger, her exhaustion, and the tiniest flicker of hope anchored her in place. She slid off the chair, gripping the envelope as if it were the only solid thing in her world. For the first time in years, she followed someone not out of fear, not because she had no choice, but because she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, her life didn't have to end on the streets. Lena clutched the envelope tightly, as if it might vanish if she let go. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her decision settling over her like a thick blanket. The idea of leaving the streets behind felt unreal, like something that only happened to other people. People with luck, with families, with second chances. Morgan watched her with quiet patience, his eyes filled with something she wasn't used to seeing: belief. Not pity, not judgment, just belief. It unnerved her. What if he was wrong about her? What if she wasn't worth saving? She forced herself to look away, her gaze landing on the reflection in the cafe's window. The girl staring back at her looked like a ghost, skin too pale from cold, lips chapped, hair tangled beyond repair. She barely recognized herself. Morgan's voice was steady, grounding. You don't have to decide everything today, Lena. One step at a time, one step. That was something she could understand. She exhaled shakily and looked at him. Where do I even start? Morgan smiled. By trusting that you're not alone anymore. He stood, pulling a neatly folded coat from the chair beside him. Come on, let's get you somewhere warm. Lena hesitated. Instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear before this could all turn out to be a cruel joke. But her hunger, her exhaustion, and the tiniest flicker of hope anchored her in place. She slid off the chair, gripping the envelope as if it were the only solid thing in her world. For the first time in years, she followed someone, not out of fear, not because she had no choice, but because she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, her life didn't have to end on the streets. The car ride was silent. Lena sat curled in the passenger seat of a sleek black SUV, her hands shoved into the sleeves of the thick coat Morgan had given her. The warmth was unfamiliar, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. She stole a glance at Morgan, who drove with the calm ease of a man who had done this before. Who was he really? And why did he care what happened to a girl like her? She wanted to ask, but the words got tangled in her throat. Instead, she turned her attention to the city lights flashing past. New York looked different from a car window, bigger, grander, full of possibilities instead of just survival. After what felt like forever, Morgan pulled into a quiet neighborhood. The buildings here were different from the places she usually slept near. The streets were clean, the sidewalks lined with trees, and the houses looked safe. The car slowed in front of a large brick townhouse with warm light spilling from the windows. Morgan turned off the engine and looked at her. This is where your new life starts. Lena swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. But deep down, a voice whispered, "What if this is just another place you'll have to leave?" She took a shaky breath. One step at a time, Morgan opened his door, stepping out into the crisp night air. Lena hesitated for just a second before she did the same. The wind brushed against her face, but this time she wasn't running from it. She was stepping into something unknown, and for the first time, she wasn't stepping into it alone. Lena stood frozen at the doorstep of the townhouse, her fingers gripping the edges of her sleeves. The weight of the envelope in her pocket felt heavier than before, as if it carried not just money, but the burden of expectation. Morgan pushed the door open, stepping inside first. The warm glow of the house spilled onto the porch, stretching toward Lena like an invitation. But invitations had never been a part of her life. She had always been the outsider, the girl on the other side of the glass. "Come in when you're ready," Morgan said gently, his voice patient, like he understood she wasn't just stepping into a house. She was stepping into a new reality. Lena hesitated. The cold night air pressed against her back, reminding her of what she was leaving behind. The alleyways, the hunger, the sleepless nights, she had survived them all. But this felt bigger than survival. It felt like the beginning of something she wasn't sure she deserved. With a deep breath, she took a step forward, then another. The moment she crossed the threshold, warmth wrapped around her like a soft blanket. The air smelled clean like cinnamon and fresh laundry. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and soft jazz played from an old record player in the corner. Everything felt lived in, not just a house, but a home. Lena stood stiffly by the door, unsure of where to put her hands. She had spent so long making herself small, invisible. Here, there was nowhere to hide. Morgan closed the door behind her and smiled. "Welcome home, Lena." Home. The word hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years pretending she didn't care about things like that, but standing here now, she realized just how much she had wanted a place to belong. "This isn't a shelter, is it?" she asked cautiously. Morgan shook his head. "No, this is a safe space. You won't have to leave unless you choose to." Lena swallowed. Choice. That was another thing she wasn't used to. Before she could process it, a voice called from another room. "Dad, you're home late." A young woman appeared in the hallway, her long curls bouncing as she came to a sudden stop. She looked at Lena, then at Morgan, eyebrows raised. "You brought a guest?" Morgan chuckled. "More like family." Lena stiffened. Family? That word didn't belong to her. The woman smiled. "I'm Jasmine. You must be Lena." Lena hesitated before nodding. Jasmine tilted her head, studying her. "Are you hungry?" Lena bit the inside of her cheek, embarrassed. She didn't want to need anything, but her body betrayed her. Jasmine grinned, like she had already expected the answer. "Come on, I made mac and cheese." Lena hesitated, but when she glanced at Morgan, he just nodded as if to say, "It's okay." So, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena let herself follow the warmth. She let herself believe, just a little, that maybe this could be real. Maybe this time, she wouldn't have to leave. The warmth of the mac and cheese filled Lena's stomach, but it didn't quiet the storm in her mind. She sat at the dining table across from Jasmine, who chatted easily with Morgan, their voices calm, familiar. The clinking of forks against plates, the scent of warm food, the soft glow of the overhead light, it all felt surreal. Too normal. Too safe. Lena forced herself to take another bite, but her grip on the fork was tense. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to run at the first sign of danger. That instinct had kept her alive on the streets, but here, in this house, it made her feel like a caged animal, trapped between wanting to trust and being terrified to believe. "So, Lena," Jasmine's voice cut through her thoughts. "How long have you been in the city?" Lena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Questions. She had learned a long time ago that questions could be dangerous. She shrugged, forcing indifference into her voice. "A while?" Morgan and Jasmine exchanged a glance. Not pitying, just understanding. Jasmine didn't push. Instead, she nodded. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters." Lena exhaled slowly. No one had ever said that to her before. The meal continued, and for the first time in years, Lena ate until she was full. It was a strange feeling. She wasn't used to stopping because she had enough. She was used to stopping because there was nothing left. As the plates were cleared, Morgan stood up. Lena, let me show you your room. Room. The word hit her harder than she expected. She followed him down a hallway, past a bookshelf filled with more books than she could count. Finally, Morgan pushed open a door, revealing a small but cozy bedroom. The bed had thick blankets, and the walls were painted a warm shade of blue. A dresser sat against the corner, and on the nightstand, a small lamp cast a golden glow. Lena stayed in the doorway, her feet frozen in place. "This is yours," Morgan said softly. "No strings, no conditions, just yours." She took a shaky breath, stepping inside cautiously. The bed looked too soft, too clean. She had spent years sleeping on concrete, on shelter cots that smelled of mildew, on benches where she had to keep one eye open. She didn't know what it meant to have something that wasn't temporary, something that wasn't about to be taken away. Morgan seemed to sense her hesitation. "Take your time." Lena nodded, but her chest was tight. She wasn't sure she was ready for this. Not the room, not the safety, not the idea that she might finally belong somewhere. Lena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The bed was too soft. The silence was too thick. She had spent so long listening for danger. Footsteps, sirens, the rustling of strangers nearby. But here there was nothing, just stillness. Her mind wouldn't let her rest. What if this wasn't real? What if they woke up tomorrow and changed their minds? She slid her hand under the pillow, clutching the envelope Morgan had given her. The money was still there. The papers, too. Proof that this was real. And yet, her chest ached with something she didn't know how to name. She turned on her side, curling into herself. For the first time in years, she had everything she needed, and it terrified her. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the room. Lena stirred, her body tensing before her mind could remember where she was. Years of waking up in unfamiliar places had trained her to be alert the moment her eyes opened. Her fingers instinctively reached beneath the pillow, clutching the envelope Morgan had given her. It was still there, still real. She exhaled slowly, scanning the room as if it might disappear. The soft bed, the neatly folded blankets, the dresser with actual drawers. Things that felt too permanent for someone like her. A knock at the door made her flinch. "Lena, you up?" Jasmine's voice was warm, casual. Lena hesitated. Did she have to answer? In the past, ignoring knocks was a survival tactic. If you didn't respond, maybe people would forget you were there. But this wasn't a shelter, and Jasmine didn't sound like someone who was going to kick her out. "Yeah," Lena said, her voice scratchy from sleep. The door creaked open slightly. Jasmine peeked in with an easy smile. "Breakfast is ready. No rush, but we made pancakes." Pancakes. Lena swallowed. She couldn't remember the last time someone had made her breakfast. "Okay," she muttered, unsure of how to react. Jasmine gave her a nod before disappearing down the hall. The smell of maple syrup and fresh coffee drifted into the room, making Lena's stomach twist. She wasn't used to eating in the morning. Most days, food was a privilege, not a routine. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The air in the room was warm, the blanket still wrapped around her like a shield. How long had it been since she slept somewhere that didn't make her wake up shivering? Lena ran a hand through her tangled hair and exhaled. She wasn't sure how to do this. She wasn't sure how to be a person with a bed, with breakfast, with people waiting for her. Lena stepped into the kitchen cautiously. Morgan sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper, while Jasmine flipped pancakes on the stove. "Look who's up," Jasmine said with a grin. "I was starting to think you were hibernating." Lena shifted on her feet, unsure of what to say. Morgan folded his newspaper. "Sleep okay?" She shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." "Good," he said, as if that was the only answer he needed. Jasmine slid a plate of pancakes in front of her, along with a glass of orange juice. "Eat up." Lena hesitated. She still wasn't used to people handing her things without expecting something in return. Morgan must have noticed because he spoke before she could overthink it. "Lena, here's the thing, you don't have to earn this. You don't have to prove anything to us. Just eat." Lena swallowed the lump in her throat. She picked up the fork and took a bite. And just like that, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight for every little thing anymore. Maybe, for the first time, she could just be. The first few days in the house felt like a dream Lena couldn't wake up from. Every morning, she braced herself for the moment it would all vanish. For the moment someone would tell her this was a mistake, that she wasn't supposed to be here. But that moment never came. Instead, there were warm breakfasts, casual conversations, and quiet moments where no one expected anything from her. And that was the hardest part. Lena didn't know how to exist in a world where she didn't have to fight to survive. The streets had given her a purpose. Wake up, find food, find shelter, avoid danger, repeat. It had been brutal, but at least she understood it. Here, in this house, with Morgan and Jasmine treating her like she belonged, she felt lost. That afternoon, Lena sat on the couch, fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie as Jasmine flipped through the TV channels. "Anything you want to watch?" Jasmine asked. Lena shrugged. "I don't know." Jasmine landed on a movie and leaned back. "You don't talk much, huh?" Lena stiffened. She knew what was coming next. People always wanted to know her story. They wanted to know why she was homeless, what had happened to her parents, why she wasn't in school. But Jasmine just smiled. "That's okay. I used to be quiet too." Lena frowned. "You?" Jasmine laughed. "Yeah, hard to believe, right?" Lena didn't respond. She just stared at the screen, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't used to people not pushing for answers. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Lena tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped in a way she hadn't expected. She had everything she had ever wanted: safety, food, warmth, but the urge to run clawed at her chest. What if this wasn't real? What if Morgan changed his mind? What if Jasmine got tired of her? She had spent years being unwanted, and she knew how quickly people let go when they realized she wasn't worth the trouble. Lena sat up, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She couldn't stay. She slid out of bed, grabbed the envelope Morgan had given her, and tiptoed toward the door. She had done this 100 times before. It was easy. Just walk out. Don't look back. She reached for the doorknob. Then she hesitated. A quiet voice in her head whispered something she had never let herself believe before. What if this time, you don't have to run? Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and for the first time in her life, she turned back. She wasn't ready to believe in this yet, but maybe, just maybe, she wanted to try. Lena lay awake long after she had turned back from the door. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her, reminding her that she had chosen to stay. She wasn't sure why. Her entire life had been built around leaving, escaping before things got worse, before someone could hurt her, before she could get too attached. But she hadn't walked out that door. That terrified her more than anything. The next morning, the smell of coffee and toast drifted into Lena's room, but she stayed curled beneath the covers, her mind racing. What now? She had never planned for what would happen after survival. She didn't know how to be part of something that wasn't temporary. A knock on the door startled her. "Lena?" "Jasmine." Lena hesitated. She could pretend to be asleep. She could ignore it. But instead, she found herself muttering, "Yeah? Come eat," Jasmine said simply. "Morgan's making eggs. He sucks at it, but we don't tell him that." Lena blinked. A joke. Jasmine wasn't checking on her like a social worker or a charity volunteer. She was just inviting her to breakfast. Lena sat up slowly, rubbing her face. She could leave any time she wanted, but for some reason, today she got up instead. At the breakfast table, Morgan slid a plate in front of her, eggs slightly overcooked, toast stacked neatly on the side. "Morning, kid," he said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Lena muttered a morning back, her voice rough from sleep. Jasmine smirked. "See? Told you she'd wake up eventually." Lena picked at her food, her stomach twisting. Not from hunger, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being included. Morgan sipped his coffee. "You doing okay?" She hesitated. People asked that all the time, but they never actually wanted the real answer. So she nodded. "Yeah." Morgan didn't push. He just nodded back. And somehow, that made it feel real. For the first time in a long time, Lena wasn't being questioned, judged, or pitted. She was just here, She didn't know how long it would last. But for now, she didn't want to run. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days passed in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. Mornings began with warm breakfasts. Afternoons drifted by in quiet conversations or moments spent curled up with a book from Morgan's endless shelves. Evenings brought laughter, soft, easy, the kind that didn't feel forced. It should have been comforting. But to Lena, it felt like a trap waiting to spring. She had spent too many years knowing that good things didn't last, that kindness always came with a price. Every night, she still slept with the envelope tucked beneath her pillow, as if it could protect her from the inevitable moment when this world would be taken from her. And yet, she hadn't left. One afternoon, Jasmine found Lena sitting on the back steps of the house, staring at the street like it held the answers she was looking for. Thinking about running again? Jasmine asked, leaning against the doorframe. Lena flinched slightly, but didn't deny it. Jasmine sighed. You know, you don't have to keep one foot out the door. Lena's fingers tightened around the fabric of her hoodie. I don't know how to do this. Jasmine sat down beside her. Do what? Stay? The word felt too big in her mouth. Jasmine nodded, as if she understood more than Lena expected. Yeah, that's hard. Lena glanced at her. You ever had to learn? Jasmine hesitated before answering. I used to push people away before they could leave first. Lena frowned. What changed? Jasmine exhaled. I stopped thinking I had to earn love. Lena looked away, her throat tight. She didn't know how to believe in something like that. But a part of her wanted to. Later that evening, Lena sat at the dinner table, her thoughts still tangled from her conversation with Jasmine. Morgan was talking about something, an old film, a memory from his past, but Lena barely heard him. Then suddenly, his deep voice cut through her haze. You don't have to fight anymore, Lena. She blinked, startled. What? Morgan set his fork down. You don't have to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. You don't have to keep proving that you deserve to be here. Lena's chest tightened. What if I mess up? Morgan smiled, warm and patient. Then you mess up, and we figure it out. Together. Lena swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Together. The word felt heavier than the envelope under her pillow. And for the first time, she wondered if she was finally ready to believe in it. The night was quiet, the kind of silence Lena still wasn't used to. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the unfamiliar softness of the blankets around her. It had been weeks now, weeks of warm meals, of Jasmine's teasing smiles, of Morgan's steady presence. Weeks of staying. And yet, the fear still lived inside her, curling in the pit of her stomach like a shadow that refused to leave. What if they changed their minds? What if they got tired of her? What if she messed up and lost everything? Her fingers twitched toward the envelope under her pillow, the only thing she had left from the life she understood. The money inside was her escape, her safety net. She could still leave. She could still run. But for the first time, the thought of leaving didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel empty. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. Then a noise. A crash from the living room. Lena bolted upright, heart hammering. She was on her feet in seconds, moving before she could think. She knew how to run. She knew how to hide. But this time she didn't. Instead, she crept down the hall, every muscle tensed. The house was dark, but she could see a faint glow from the living room. She turned the corner and froze. Morgan was sitting on the floor, rubbing his head, a broken picture frame beside him. Jasmine stood over him, hands on her hips, trying to stifle a laugh. Told you that shelf was too high, old man, Jasmine teased. Morgan groaned. You gonna help me up, or just stand there gloating? Lena's heart was still racing, but now, for a different reason. She had expected danger. She had expected something to go wrong. But instead, this was just a home, just a family. Jasmine finally pulled Morgan to his feet, still grinning. Then she turned and saw Lena standing in the hallway. Her expression softened. You okay? Lena hesitated. She had been ready to run. But instead, she nodded. Yeah. Jasmine studied her for a moment, then said casually, Come on, if we're up, might as well have ice cream. Lena blinked. At midnight. Morgan shrugged. House rule. No time is a bad time for ice cream. Lena hesitated again. The fear, the instinct to pull away, still whispered in her mind. But then, she took a step forward, and another, and soon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, a spoon in her hand, the cold sweetness melting on her tongue as Jasmine and Morgan argued about the best ice cream flavors. For the first time, the voice in her head telling her to leave was quieter than the one telling her to stay. The next morning, Lena woke up without checking for the envelope under her pillow. She stretched, feeling lighter than she had in years. And when she walked into the kitchen, Morgan just smiled and said, "Morning, kid." And this time, Lena believed it. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and something sweet from the kitchen. Lena stretched, blinking against the soft sunlight spilling through the curtains. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up in fear. She didn't check for the envelope, didn't reach for her hoodie-like armor. She just existed. The feeling was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. She pulled herself out of bed, her bare feet touching the warm hardwood floor. The house was quiet except for the distant clatter of dishes and the faint hum of a jazz song playing on the radio. And then laughter. Jasmine's. Lena paused in the doorway listening. Laughter had always felt like something meant for other people. For families in warm houses, for kids who weren't left behind, for people who had a place. But now, in this house, in this moment, it felt like it belonged to her, too. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward. In the kitchen, Morgan was standing by the stove, wearing an apron that looked ridiculous on him, flipping pancakes. Jasmine sat at the counter, smirking. "You're trying too hard," Jasmine teased. "You want breakfast or not?" Morgan shot back. Jasmine chuckled. "I want breakfast that isn't burnt." Morgan rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Lena leaned against the doorway, watching the easy rhythm between them. They weren't just people who lived together. They were family. And somehow so was she. Jasmine spotted her first. "Look who finally decided to wake up." Lena smirked, the reaction feeling more natural than it should. Morgan turned, lifting an eyebrow. "Pancakes?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Morgan slid a plate in front of her without another word, like it was the most normal thing in the world. And maybe it was. Later that day, Lena sat on the porch steps, watching the street. She didn't know why she had come outside. Maybe out of habit. Maybe to remind herself of where she had been before all of this. She reached into her pocket, expecting to feel the envelope. But it wasn't there. Her heart skipped a beat. Then she remembered. It was still under her pillow, and she didn't need it anymore. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't running. She was home. The thought hit her like a wave, crashing over her, filling her lungs with something she had never truly felt before. Belonging. A warm hand ruffled her hair, breaking her thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" Morgan asked, his deep voice steady. Lena looked up at him. The man who had seen her when the rest of the world looked away. The man who hadn't just given her $20, but a life. She thought about all the times she had wanted to run. All the nights she had convinced herself she wasn't worth saving. Then, she smiled softly. Nothing. And for the first time, she meant it. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from, and let us know if the story of justice